Dr. James had clipped 1,000 fleeces in his life, and yet the sound of shears against wool still steadied him the way a metronome steadies a pianist. The barn smelled of hay and old rain. Dust lifted in sleepy halos where sunlight pierced the gaps in the siding. The sheep, mud-caked, barrel-chested under months of unshorn growth, stood in the wooden stanchion, its breath a soft machine in the quiet. He guided the clippers along the spine, letting the fleece peel away in a single rivering sheet, when a small, hard shape clacked against the clipper guard. Cat litter, he thought, frowning as he teased out the gray crystals with gloved fingers. He had shorn sheep crusted with burrs, hedgehog spines, once even a zipper, but cat litter lodged in wool. This was a first. He lifted his eyes to Frank, the farmer hovering at the stall gate. "Frank, have you seen this?" Frank stepped closer, pushing his cap back. What on earth would that be? James didn't answer. He was already tracing the litter trail into the deep of the fleece, parting wool the way a librarian parts pages, careful, reverent. The wool was warm as bread. Something moved within. He froze. The movement came again, minute, tentative. Not burrs, not a trapped mouse either. He pressed 2 fingers to the place and felt a heartbeat like the tapping of a wristwatch under a quilt. "Hold the head," he said softly. "Don't let her buck." Frank's hands tightened on the yoke. James eased the clippers aside and went to work with scissors and patience, snipping a pathway through matted curls. A damp, squeaking sound rose up, thin and insistent. Frank's mouth fell open. "Doc!" James parted the last clutch of wool and saw an eye the color of a coffee bean, glazed and newborn. A kitten, wedged in a pocket of fleece, as if tucked there by a careful hand. He swallowed twice before words found him. "Kitten," he said, because language had to start somewhere. By the time he was done, there were 4, each no larger than the palm of his hand, their bellies bald and pink, their heads shaking with the tremors of life. He couldn't pull them free without pulling wool with skin attached, so he shaved little windows into the fleece, soft squares of light among thunderstorms of matted gray, and lifted the kittens out one by one. Frank whispered, "How long could they—" "Long enough to make this make no sense," James said, but his hands were steady as he swaddled them in a saddle blanket Sandra kept folded over the stall rail. Sandra arrived with clean towels and the gentle competence that farm life breeds. She had bottle-fed lambs in January blizzards and nursed a swallow with a broken wing to spring. She watched the kittens the way a tide watches shorelines, an attention that holds but does not crowd. Frank dashed into town for formula while James examined the sheep. Under the grime, the ewes' gums were a healthy shell pink. Her eyes were clear, the rumen active. She didn't startle when the kittens mewled. She lowered her head to them and breathed. "Healthy," James said, astonished in spite of himself. "Condition score's decent. She hasn't been starving. How does a sheep wandering God knows where stay in decent condition?" Sandra asked. "And how does a sheep collect kittens?" James shrugged. "When I find the manual on this, I'll let you know." By the time Frank returned, the kittens' voices had risen to a chorus. They latched onto the tiny rubber nipples as if they were ropes thrown to drowning swimmers. Milk dribbled at the corners of their mouths, and their paws kneaded the air like bakers late to a market. "They're 2 weeks, give or take," James said. Eyes open, ears up, but still all burr and belly. Frank chuckled, nervousness turning to fondness under the kitten's insistence. Big appetites for such little things. Sandra tucked the blanket around them and set the basket at the sheep's side. The ewe shifted her weight to make room. When Sandra moved the basket to change the bedding, the kitten's cries sharpened to panic. She set them back, and the cries ebbed to hiccuping contentment. "Bonded," James murmured, "to warmth, to smell, to the idea of mother, maybe." He looked at the sheep, and the sheep looked back, old velvet in her eyes. That night, Questions kept James from sleep. His phone filled with notes as if he were dictating to his future self. Wild shelter? Barn? Mother cat nearby? Litter stuck in wool equals nest proximity. Fecal? Parasites? Check. At dawn, he called Lila, a colleague who ran a clinic 2 towns over. You see any queens come through about 2 weeks back? Calico or gray tabby? Underweight? Stressed? Lila yawned. Pregnant stray. Gray with white blaze. Bolted from the carrier while we were drawing up fluids. Never came back? Timing? 18 days ago, James stared at his cracked ceiling paint. Matches my kittens. Your kittens? Long story, he said, and told her the short version. Meanwhile, Frank blasted a message through the county farm co-op listserv. Lost sheep found. Unique spiral marking on left flank. If you're missing one, call Frank Halter. He included a photo of the ewe in the stanchion, blanket basket of kittens at her side. By 9, the phone started ringing. Most calls were curiosity and a Stetson. One, though, sounded like hope. Name's Eric Hart, the man said. Lost a ewe in the storm 18 days back. Spiral whirl left side. Looks like a tornado. Had her since she was a bottle baby. Come, Frank said. If she's yours, you'll know. Eric arrived mid-afternoon, a long man in a short coat, gravel snapping under his boots as he crossed the yard. He didn't speak until he stood by the stall. Then he breathed out, the sound catching in his throat. That's her. He reached, stopped, asked, May I? And James nodded. Eric laid a hand on the ewe's neck. The sheep leaned into him, the way exhausted people lean into good chairs. I named her Maud, he said, rubbing the notch of muscle behind her ear. On account of she's stubborn and kind, and every Maud I've ever known was both. He showed them the spiral in her wool, a whirl like a galaxy half solved, and the healed scar by her hawk from a fence tangle when she was a yearling. Went through the fence when lightning spooked the flock. Spent 3 nights walking the hedgerows looking for her. His fingers trembled. I thought coyotes. I thought everything they told him the rest. And Eric listened with a face that kept changing its mind between joy and disbelief. When the kitten squeaked, Maud made a sound in her throat that was not bleat and not sigh, but something like present. How? Eric began, and ended there, the question wider than words. The mother cat, if Lila's stray was indeed the mother, remained a question mark shaped like absence. 2 days later, a boy in the next township found her body in the high grass near the hedgerow by Eric's property. The rain had been hard that week. The road was not kind to small travelers. Sandra wrapped the news in as much softness as truth allows. Eric sat on the hay bale across from Maud and looked at the kittens, then at the doorway where the sun spilled a bright opinion across the dirt. She did the impossible, he said of the cat, and Maud let her. That afternoon, Eric remembered the old camera, a dusty, forgotten security unit still bolted to the corner beam of his equipment shed, the kind you use until you forget you ever installed it. He and James wrestled with tangled wires and a monitor that smelled of warmed plastic, and when the image stuttered to life, they watched the storm again. Lightning made a metronome of night. The camera caught the shed mouth as if it were a stage where the wind performed. They saw Maud lope into the frame, wild-eyed, raining mud. She circled once, twice, and then stilled, sides heaving. A minute later, a blur slid along the wall, the gray and white queen. She carried a kitten by its scruff, with the gravity of a nurse bearing news. On the screen, the cat set the kitten down in hay, returned to fetch another, and then another, until 4 lay in a line like punctuation marks at the end of a hard sentence. She looked up when Maud stepped closer. James leaned in, forgetting to breathe. The sheep lowered her head and breathed the kittens in, one by one, then turned broadside and knelt, careful, deliberate, so that the bowl of her body made shelter. The queen hesitated, then began to tuck the kittens into Maud's wool, tiny paws disappearing into warmth. No sound reached them through the grainy feed, but each movement read like dialogue. Help? Yes. We share the night. When the playback ended, the men sat a while in the electric quiet of the shed. Animals, Eric said finally, keep teaching the same class, and we keep failing the test. Word outran them. A reporter from the county paper came first, then a morning show crew from the city whose anchor wore shoes too clean to believe in barns. Frank let them film on 2 conditions: no flash and no crowding Maud. The kittens, Sandra had started calling them by paint chip names that stuck: ash, soot, marble, and chalk, piled into each other as cameras whirred. With attention came the county. A white SUV with the seal of Animal Services rolled into the drive one blue noon. A woman named Ortiz stepped out, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. "We've had calls," she said, "some concerned about biosecurity. Sheep aren't standard foster stock for kittens." She tried to smile, failed somewhere near polite. James met her halfway. He had trained with people like her, careful, procedural, necessary to a rule-bound world. "Neither are heating lamps supposed to act like mothers," he said mildly, "but they do in a pinch." He showed her Maud's records, the deworming he'd administered, the antibiotics he'd held in reserve but never needed. He pointed out the kitten's weight gain chart Sandra had made on a scrap of feed ledger paper, neat columns of grams and dates. Ortiz put the shield of her clipboard down. She watched as chalk kneaded at Maud's flank, then rolled onto his back and fell immediately asleep. "We can classify this as temporary, supervised co-housing," she said at last, "with weekly checks." "Done," James said, and Sandra brought coffee, and Frank told the story again with his hands. Eric held out on naming Maud's fosterlings for all of a day before giving in. "Doesn't feel right," he said, leaving them as concepts. He tried out the names Sandra had used and made small edits like a man arranging frames on a wall. Ash became ashen, soot stayed soot, marble was too stately and became pebble for the way she chased specks of dust, and chalk remained chalk because he left white smears of formula on everything he touched. "Names stick," Sandra observed. "Names ask us to show up," Eric countered. By the 3rd week, the kittens had learned the map of the barn, the warm square in sunlight by the east door, the rough tongue of the salt lick on the post, the exact distance one could climb up a bale before Frank's "Hey now" voice began in earnest. Maud learned the map of their voices. She would turn toward even a soft mule with the unfrazzled alertness of a schoolteacher who knows which whisper matters and which can be ignored. Veterinary medicine is a tally of wins and losses written in the same ink. That spring, James's ledger had tilted toward loss. A foal he couldn't pull in time, a dog who arrived 2 hours too late, an old mare whose lungs surrendered while the apple trees were still in bloom. He had begun to carry a small, quiet tiredness between his ribs, a box he never put down. The kittens and Maud set the box down for him for a while. He found himself coming by Frank's farm at odd hours, feigning errands. He brought a scale and a better heat pad and a toy, a sheepskin mouse that felt like a joke he wanted to tell the universe. He examined Maud's hoof, where the old fence scar had turned threadbare. He changed the bandage on a cut Frank received while fixing a gait because that, too, felt part of the patient's set. In the evenings, after the last appointment, and before the tiredness could climb back onto his ribs, he would sit on an upturned bucket and watch the barn teach itself harmony. Pebble learned to stalk Soot, who tolerated the stalking like an older brother and then bolted 3 inches at the last second to let her feel the thrill of speed. Ashen found the one loose nail that sang when batted and performed private concerts. Chalk, chaos embodied, tried to nurse on Maud's elbow and then fell asleep before finishing the attempt. "Look at you," James muttered to them all. "You impossible proof." A letter arrived addressed to the farmer with the sheep that saved the kittens. It came with a stamp from 3 states away and handwriting determined as a plow mule. Inside was a single page written in a looped script. My mama used to say, "The world is rough, but keep soft pockets in its coat." When I read about your sheep and the kittens, I felt one of those pockets. I lost my husband this year. Every day I look for something that doesn't take the pain but makes space around it. Your story did that. Thank you for letting it be told. Sandra read it aloud to the barn, and the barn kept the sound for a while. As the kittens grew, so did the number of people offering to take them. A retired teacher who had lost her Tom the previous winter, a pair of sisters who ran the bookstore in town and wanted a shop cat with charisma, a boy whose mother said his chores were not yet at a level befitting a pet, but whose eyes stacked dreams like bales in a loft. Not yet, James kept saying. 8 weeks minimum. They need their shots. They need to learn the language of bodies from Maud and from each other. It wasn't just protocol. He had come to believe there were lessons in that barn he didn't understand well enough to interrupt. Eric faced a harder decision. Do I take Maud home, he asked one evening, or does she belong to more than me now? He scratched under her jaw, and she leaned her heavy head into his thigh. She ran here in fear and made a life out of it. Lives end up with more owners than paperwork accounts for, Sandra said. Sometimes a place becomes a person. Frank cleared his throat. She's welcome here as long as she wants. You know that. Eric nodded, and the matter didn't resolve so much as move to a gentler shelf in his mind. The coyotes sang on a Tuesday. They always did, somewhere beyond the hedgerows, their voices bright as coins tossed in a metal bucket. Usually they sang far enough off that the barn only shrugged. That night the chorus shifted closer, turned from song to argument. Maud went rigid. The kittens, who had begun to treat the world as theirs by right, flattened into instinct, 4 commas in search of a sentence. Frank reached for the old spotlight by the door. James, who had been wrapping a bandage on a neighbor's goat brought by for a quick fix, stood and listened. The fence on the west pasture was the one that had been compromised by the winter freeze. They'd been meaning to move the repair up the list. Meaning had not yet turned into action. Frank and James grabbed flashlights and the half-rusted tools every farm keeps by the exit. Sandra stuffed the kittens into the pocket of her jacket. The jacket bulged with small indignations and stood by Maud as if her body were a fence post. They found the breach where the old oak leaned drunk over the wire. 2 shapes flickered in the mouth of the pasture, too small to be a threat this close to 3 adults, with lights and the high, declarative voice of a woman who had 0 patience left for predators. Frank shouted, and the shape skittered back into brush. He and James worked the wire taut enough for night and truth enough for coyotes. When they returned to the barn, Sandra had one hand on Maud's withers and the other guarding the jacket pocket like a referee. "Everybody okay?" James asked. "Everybody's staying okay," Sandra said, which was a vow, then added, "And I need a better jacket because this one is now a multi-cat model." James laughed then, not because it was funny, though it was, but because laughter was the body's way of setting down a fear without breaking it. At 8 weeks, the clinic day came. James brought the carrier big enough for the idea of 4 cats and small enough for the reality of carrying them. He had a nurse prep syringes and a scale, and the stickers kids liked that said, "I was brave," because bravery is both relative and universal. The kittens protested the indignity of transport and then fell asleep in the warm plastic dark with the resignation of toddlers. Maud watched the door close, then turned her head toward the aisle where James's truck would pass, as if memorizing the direction bravery took. The shots were quick, the exam gentle. Pebble batted at the stethoscope and then pretended she hadn't. Soot placed a paw on James's wrist while he listened to the tiny thunder of his chest. Ashen sang the song of his people. Chalk tried to eat the corner of the vaccination record and succeeded in removing one layer of laminate. Back at the farm, Maud smelled each of them as they tumbled out of the carrier, then gave a single approving huff, the kind teachers reserve for students who return from a field trip with both learning and all their parts. By late summer, the county organized a fair with a theme that might as well have been, "We remember how to be kind." They asked Frank if the barn crew would come to be the unofficial grand marshals of the pet parade. He said yes, on the condition of shade and reasonable decibel levels. They built a small pen with a low fence so Maud could rest without being pawed by the well-meaning. The kittens had their own climbing post and a platform where they could lord over their public like benevolent monarchs. Children lined up with questions that fell in two categories: the practical, how do they not fall out, and the metaphysical, do the kittens think the sheep is their mom? James answered with the truth, as best as science allows. They bonded to warmth and to a body that let them be. Mom is larger than milk. An elderly man in a bolo tie stood at the back for a long time and then approached. "Grew up in Dust Bowl years," he said. "Saw a mare lie down so a stray dog and her pups could sleep against her in a hard freeze. Folks said it was a trick of survival. Maybe it was. Still looked like love." "It can be both," Sandra said. "The good things usually are." Adoptions were arranged with a care that bordered on ceremony. Pebble went to the bookstore sisters, where she learned that nap piles on poetry sell as well as any window display. Soot moved in with the retired teacher and took to watching birds with a studiousness that would have earned top marks. Ashen found the boy who had stacked his dreams quietly. By the time James did the home check, the boy's chore chart had blossomed, and his mother, surprised by his persistence, surprised herself by being proud. Chalk became Eric's shadow. "Trouble recognizes its kin," Sandra observed, watching the kitten learn to ride in the bib of Eric's overalls. Maud watched each kitten leave with a patience that broke and repaired hearts in the same beat. She would smell the carrier, look long at the person carrying it, and then lower her head to the space the kitten had occupied, breathing their absence until it softened. When the last of the carriers left, the barn was quieter, the way a house is after a family reunion. Not empty, exactly, just full of echoes. "Will she miss them?" Frank asked. "She will," James said, "and also, she will rest." Eric came one evening with a halter and a question. "Maud," he said softly in her ear, "what do you say we go home?" They walked the old lane at dusk, when everything looks closer to itself. Maud stepped into the trailer without fuss, as if the week she had spent elsewhere had made more room in her for movement. Chalk rode in the cab in a box with holes and a dignity that would have made kings reconsider their posture. At Eric's farm, the flock greeted Maud with the soft thunder of recognition. She paced the fence line once, twice, as if reacquainting herself with the geometry of belonging, then lowered her head to graze. Chalk discovered the farm dog and declared them both unacceptable and necessary in that order. Eric walked the perimeter and fixed the bad place by the oak before sleeping that night. Months pass, whether we notice them or not. The story, which had once eaten counties for breakfast, settled into the slow metabolism of memory. The news crews turned their cameras elsewhere. The fairgrounds went back to hosting quieter arguments between chickens and wind. But the letter writers kept writing sometimes, and Frank kept an old shoebox under the feed bin with notes he read on days the weather wouldn't make up its mind. James's ledger tilted back toward wins, not because the losses stopped, but because he had started bringing a different pen to the page. He began a program to train high schoolers interested in veterinary work, citing community resilience to the grant committee and barn magic to Sandra. He got a second tech for the clinic. He slept better the night before foaling due dates. Ortiz from Animal Services stopped by one afternoon to drop off a laminated certificate that read Exemplary Temporary Cross-Species Fostering, Case Study 14B. She rolled her eyes at the bureaucracy of the title and squeezed Sandra's hand in the human version of a bleat of approval. Eric brought by eggs and a photograph in a frame. Maud in his pasture, the spiral on her flank catching the sun, Chalk perched on the fence post like a small, disreputable gargoyle. "Thought the barn ought to have this," he said. Sandra hung it by the door, where all departures had to glance at it. In autumn, Maud came due for shearing again. Eric asked James to do it. "Feels right," he said, "like getting a haircut from the man who found you a family." They set up the stanchion in Eric's yard, the grass crisp as new paper. Chalk supervised from the top step of the porch, tail electing to be a flag. James ran the clippers along the spine, felt the smooth give beneath, the satisfying ribbon of fleece falling to the tarp. No cat litter this time, only burrs and bits of summer. He worked slower than he had to and faster than nostalgia wanted. "What do you think she knew that night?" Eric asked, not looking up from gathering fleece into clean bundles. "I don't know what she knew," James said. "I know what she allowed." He clicked the clippers off and rested his hand on Maud's shoulder. "And I know what the cat asked." Eric nodded the way men nod when words have to make room for something else. They bagged the fleece, marked it, laughed at Chalk's attempt to sneak a burr into the label for posterity. The air smelled like the inside of a sweater drawer and apples nearby, forgetting the tree. In the town square, there's a mural now. It isn't grand, no city paid for it, but it's tended. A local painter stood on a ladder for 3 weekends and grinned down at anyone who asked what she was doing. "It's a reminder," she said, "that the world is rough, yes, but it keeps soft pockets in its coat." She painted a sheep with a spiral flank and 4 small shadows tucked into her wool, and if you stand at a particular angle, the wool looks like clouds and the shadows like stars. Children play under it. Tourists take photos and move on to pie. The people who know the story don't need the mural to remember, but they like having a place to aim their remembering. In Eric's pasture, Maud grazes with her flock. In the bookstore, Pebble naps on new releases and marginalia springs up around her like grass. Soot watches sparrows, and a retired teacher occasionally reads out loud to him because literature asks us to show up too. Ashen and a boy make a planet of a backyard where chores are constellations that result in tennis balls thrown exactly where a dog hopes they'll go. Chalk troubles and accompanies Eric in equal measure. And in Frank's barn, the space where a basket once sat is just a space again, filled now and then with ordinary hay. Sometimes James pauses there and runs his palm along the grain of the rail. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. The barn keeps the sound for him anyway, because a sheep kept company with a mother and her young through a bad night, and 4 small lives learned a language humans spend whole careers trying to translate. Because survival and kindness are not enemies. Because we keep failing the test and, sometimes, on a good week with the right wind, we pass.